Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you from the CHEK News World Headquarters here in Victoria. Halloween is nearing its spooky season in BC politics, mainly because there's so much going on all over the place. It's scary just trying to keep on top of it. But thankfully, that is why we have the Pod Squad here to break everything down. Allie Blades, Jeff Ferrier, and Jillian Oliver are here. We are going to jump right into this. Much of this week at the legislature was spent debating the NDP government's short-term rental legislation. We talked about that last week. It is essentially legislation that pretty much bans the use of investment properties for Airbnb-style rentals in most urban settings here in the province. BC United had some amendments that they tried to put on the floor here to change this, and they wanted to add a property, an investment property you could rent. They wanted to change the definition of a short-term rental from 90 days in the bill to 30 days. They wanted an exemption for traveling for cancer treatment and an exemption for big events like FIFA 2026, when we all know there will not be enough hotel rooms to accommodate all the people. They were shot down, but they raised some interesting points, and we should go around and just talk a bit about those. Allie, the Premier, called these loopholes for investors, and homes are for people was the slogan they kept using. BC United said this went too far. How do we think that messaging and positioning played out on this debate this week?
I find it rich that he's calling it loopholes, especially since I want to point out here that the market's going to find a way. And I talked a little bit about this last week, where my biggest concern is the policing of all of this. And it doesn't necessarily work unless you really crack down on it. But the black market of short-term rentals will persist on. And that's when it becomes dangerous, not even for just the renters, but for the owners as well. And so, I mean, their policy is just riddled with loopholes as is. But I want to give a big shout out to MLA Corinne Kirkpatrick. She's the critic for this portfolio on the BC United side. And I just really felt like she gained a lot of momentum. She really found her stride in this policy in a way that I've never seen before. And so it's just been really great to see. And so I don't think that while this did pass and it's moving forward, I don't think that she's going to let up on this. I certainly don't think that BC United's going to let up on this. And they're still going to continue to advocate on the opposition side. But the disaster of this policy is really the impact that all of a sudden renter or people are going to face. And that's just because it's just all of a sudden. This just came out of nowhere, and people can't really figure out how they're going to protect their investments. And these aren't like big and bad investors that everyone's making it out to be. These were people who are trying to pay the bills just like everybody else. But I am not the expert in all of this, so I went and did a little bit of research, and I found a report authored by the Conference Board of Canada, and they did a survey with Airbnb. And so, take that for what it is. But here's what I found very interesting. Airbnb units account for 0.5% point of housing stock in the 330 neighborhoods that they surveyed. And so the author of this report then went on to say that Canada needs to bring more solutions to the table to increase supply of homes. Increasing that stock by 1% is no silver bullet. And so translating this back to the BC NDP, I think Minister Ravi Kahlon talks a big talk in all of this, but will it actually result in the impact that we need in our housing market? I mean, we'll find out soon enough. So I think it's just like a really big show.
Mm-hmm. There's only two things people really care about here is the price of buying a home or the price of renting a home. I mean, that's really what the housing crisis boils down to. And there's no clear linkage from the Premier or the Housing Minister that this will result in a change to either. It may not. The market forces of interest rates and and whatever may change that separate from this. But you're right, making that connection there and the impact of this is still something we're not sure that we're going to see. Jeff, MLAs from all parties were kind of deluged by an email letter writing campaign from concerned property owners. BC United said that some of those concerns, like nurses and doctors who use short-term rentals to backfill in healthcare, or the film sector that brings people in, led to some of these changes, and they proposed changes, and that they aren't loopholes. What do you think of that sort of contrast in messaging?
So again, full disclosure, I worked with some folks in the short-term rental space. My response is that the government heard them out and made a decision, and it moved fast at world record pace. They introduced it and got it past third reading in under 2 weeks. The last time something moved that quickly in Victoria, it was when Craig James, the former speaker, first laid eyes on his beloved wood splitter. To us, a wood splitter may be just a machine, but to Craig James, it's a symbol of strength. Reminder that love can be found in unexpected places, even in companionship with an inanimate object that takes big pieces of wood and splits them into smaller, more burnable pieces of wood. But
in an emergency.
It was, the NDP was, I was struck by the NDP's resolve on this. I think it's a sign that they clearly see this issue as one that resonates with ordinary folks, everyday people who aren't worried about, investment property and how well it does for folks, but a housing crisis and getting housing, any housing, out into the market to help people. And so, it'll be interesting to see the opposition keep pushing. I have you have to have some empathy for some of the folks who've come forward with stories and are in a difficult position right now. But if BC United thinks that there's political advantage in saying we need to keep Airbnbs because what about weddings in the summer when there are people living in RVs on the street? I'm not sure that's a winning long-term proposition for them, and I think the government's happy with where it's landed after these last 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Homes for people, not investors, is a pretty powerful line that the government has landed on. It's this blanket that they have thrown over this entire debate, so that even points that may have some legitimacy, the length of the stay, being criticized at 90 days when most jurisdictions have picked 30 days, you don't have the debate. You just raise the point and the government says, hey, homes are for people, not investors. And then the whole debate just kind of dissolves around political talking points. Jillian, is that a good approach for government? Do you think that message is powerful enough to just push all of what may be unintended consequences aside?
Some, maybe not all. I do think the 30 days, if there is going to be a sticking point, that might be one that gets changed. It's pretty common. It's kind of funny. I was thinking I've had to have a sublet for 30 days to work on a political campaign before, and that's really common. It's actually going to hit probably a lot of people come election time. And there's lots of reasons that people need 30-day rentals. So I that's kind of more what I was expecting. I was surprised to see the 90 days. That's the one where I could see the government making a change in regulation or something later. I think the rest of the points that Allie and Jeff made are really valid. I do think this policy is a little bit more about posturing than policy. The government was gleeful to say we represent people and they represent investors when talking about the proposed amendments from BC United. I think I was surprised that United went with a proposal to allow people to have one investment property. There was no chance that was going to get passed, and I'm surprised that they thought that would be a political win. The rest, I think, seem like common sense to people, like allowing short-term rentals for special events like FIFA, but they're not really practical. I don't think that would work in practice. People aren't going to buy an apartment just for a temporary event and put it on Airbnb. So I don't think that makes much sense. And as far as the weddings and other things that they raised, a lot of those are going to be in rural areas outside of cities and things like that. If they're not, there's going to be hotels available. So I think that this was a win for the government. I think they've obviously determined that this is good politics for them. And that's why we saw them push it through so quickly. And they're going to continue to talk about it as part of their narrative when they point out other things that the opposition opposed, like the speculation tax.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the speculation tax. I think it's a more fleshed out bit of legislation than speculation tax, which changed so many times during its development. We didn't even know what it was. It has produced a very nebulous number of potential units that may have gone back into the rental pool. Who knows? The outcome hasn't had a huge impact on the kind of visible progress in housing that the government sort of said, and yet it's part of a political narrative of standing up for a certain sector of people against investors and empty homes and that type of thing. It is worth noting that one of the biggest clients for Airbnb in this province is the BC government, who uses Airbnb in part to move people around when they're needed, including in the healthcare sector, to keep hospital ERs open and that type of thing. So there will be an impact directly to government for changing this from 90 to 30 days, and we'll see what that is. The government doesn't really want to argue that. It just says homes are for people. So anyways, we will keep an eye on that. The legislation passed. It got royal assent with the LG, including with the Police Act changes. We talked about that last week, so it's now law that Surrey's municipal force is the future police force of jurisdiction in Surrey. That's off that goes. We'll probably end up talking about it in the weeks ahead as that makes its way through. Outside of the legislature, another topic we should discuss late in the week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau dropped quite a bombshell announcing that he was exempting home heating fuel in rural areas from the federal carbon tax for the next 3 years. Largely looks like it's in response to anger in Atlantic Canada, which had started paying the federal carbon tax on heating oil in July. In BC, the government caught off guard, one of the only provinces not included in this because we have our own carbon tax here. And the question now is, should BC follow suit? Will it have to? Does it need to in exempting this type of fuel in the future? So Jillian, let's stay with you on that. It raises weird situations here in BC and, in other parts of the country where they're still taxing natural gas, which burns cleaner than oil with the carbon tax, but the dirtier fuel is exempt for 3 years due to politics and that type of thing. So how does the public wrap its mind around this, and what do you think the government in BC is going to have to do?
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to watch play out. This is really the first time we've seen the federal government blink on the carbon tax. And I think, the opposition, the federal Conservatives have been raising this, holding rallies around this, making a lot of noise. I think, the biggest problem with it is that the government's original assertions from a policy and like a factual perspective are correct, that most of the increase in home heating costs has come from fossil fuel inflation since 2020. Heating oil has increased by the carbon tax has increased by 12 cents per liter, but the average price on heating oil has increased by 75 cents per liter. So it's mostly driven by surging oil prices, driven by things outside of our country's control in geopolitics, as well as record-breaking profits for the fossil fuel industry. So this is a move that the federal government is making because of politics, because they're worried about their polling numbers, and because they want to hold on to their support in Atlantic Canada, where most people who use heating oil are. In BC, we didn't get this exemption because we've got our own carbon tax that predates the federal one. Government has came out with a statement saying that they were surprised, that they expected better partnership from the federal government. They're obviously not happy, but they did say that they'd be responding for what is probably a small number of people in BC that use heating oil. But like you said, now we're seeing other premiers, like the Premier of Alberta, start to clamor for exemptions for natural gas, which a lot more people in BC do use. So I think, this is not the end of this discussion. It'll be interesting to see where the federal government goes, because this really has been the centerpiece of their policy, and the carbon tax is widely seen by climate policy experts as the most efficient, effective, and progressive means of reducing emissions. And in fact, it has been very effective in BC, both at reducing emissions, making the oil and gas industry less emissions intensive, but also in driving innovation and helping to bolster in both innovation within that industry and to drive investment into clean energy, which is where we really need to go. So it's going to be a really tough road to walk for the BC government as the politics around this shift at the federal level.
Mm-hmm. It puts BC in a bind for sure, Allie. As the federal Liberals move due to pressure from the federal Conservatives. Now the BC NDP have to decide if they move as well. What do you think the province is going to do here?
Well, it's their move. I don't know if they necessarily do anything about this quite yet, but I think there is an opportunity to learn from the federal government here. Jillian, I really like what you said here, blinking on the carbon tax, because what we've essentially determined here was that it was never really about the environment and more so about taxing. And so let's call this for what this is. This is panic in the Atlantic. Like it's political spin if I've ever seen it before. But here's my latest political ick while we're on this topic. The announcement made by the Prime Minister was very cavalier. He was smiling, he was joking during this announcement, but there's nothing funny about this, right? There are people who are trying to pay the bills, trying to work towards affordability in this country. And here he is making this announcement, which is a very serious one. But the way that he delivered it, I had issue with it. And I know it's such a small thing, but it really shows to me how unserious he is about this issue. And sir, when you're talking about upfront payments and when you're talking about money in your pocket, well, that's a lie. That's not money that they're giving to you. That's money that they've already taken from you as taxpayers. And so I just thought the communications around this was awful. The timing of it for 3 years, it's sus. I mean, that's the federal election coming up. But this is a federal government that has no problem picking fights with provinces as well. We've seen it before with Alberta. I think this is potentially the start of a new political fight with BC. Great.
BC, I don't know what they do. Jeff, what do you think?
I think British Columbians will get some form of provincial affordability help with their home heating costs. I expect what BC does will be less rushed, clumsy, and desperate than what we saw from Ottawa in terms of balancing affordability and climate. Hey, anyone remember how West Kelowna was on fire and how Lytton burned to the ground, and we had all those wildfires that were fueled by climate change this summer, and how we had those gigantic floods and how things are getting worse? We've got a real pressing problem here. Like, how do we help people afford to take the steps needed to fight climate change, which I just talked about? It's a pretty big deal. But the solution that we're seeing from Trudeau here is like responding to a child tooth cavity epidemic with free Halloween candy for everyone forever, right? It just doesn't make sense. So if the goal here is to help people do the right thing to fight climate change and help make it more affordable, maybe do something like pay to put hydro-powered electric heat pumps in their house instead of making home heating fuel less expensive. Don't create hardship for folks who are having a hard time, but do something that will actually deal with the problem. More solutions, less emoting, please, Prime Minister. And if he thinks what he's done here is to strike down his political opponents who've been campaigning against the carbon tax, in fact, what he's done is made them more powerful than he can possibly imagine. He's legitimized the calls to axe the carbon tax, and he's emboldened those folks like Danielle Smith. You already see her saying, take the tax off in natural gas. He's emboldened all those folks to demand even more. So these are interesting times. I think British Columbians will get some form of help, but it will not be as clumsy and silly as the Ottawa help.
Just to stay on this for a minute, we did see a poll out in the past week about what British Columbians think of the carbon tax, and it raised this possibility that if we are going to see a change in the federal government to the Conservatives, who have promised to eliminate the carbon tax, do British Columbians want us to continue to go this alone, including on this exemption or on the full carbon tax, when Ottawa makes changes for its own political purposes? And it was a split, kind of, half of British Columbians. I don't know. Jillian, just back to you quickly on that. Should the parties take anything away from that poll on where people are sitting on this issue?
Well, I know that the Conservatives, the provincial Conservatives, have called for an end to the carbon tax. I'm not sure where BC United is. I think they might have called for a freeze, maybe, and more specific exemptions to specific sectors. I think it would be short-sighted for the reasons that Jeff pointed out. I think we experience some of the worst effects of climate change here. They're very expensive. It's also hitting our budget, both on the revenue side, where we're seeing for the first time we're in deficit because of declining natural gas revenues, and on the cost side because of the cost of the wildfires. So I think that it would be a very reactionary approach, and I think ultimately a losing one, because British Columbians are used to being leaders on climate policy, and we've seen so much progress on building our economy and on reducing emissions, and I think that's something that people are proud of. I do think that Jeff is right. The governments do need to, all the parties need to look at how do we make climate action improve affordability for people, and that was a second part of this announcement from the feds, that they're increasing rebates for heat pumps, and that's why they have the 3-year temporary suspension, so that they can hopefully transition more people to get onto heat pumps and off oil before they hopefully reinstate the carbon tax. So I think that looking to measures that can couple climate action with affordability is the way to go, because otherwise we're just going to be shooting ourselves in the foot, continuing to be beholden to volatile oil prices that are out of our control, while also continuing to burn the planet.
Mm-hmm. Allie, just quickly, 30 seconds to you. Do you think that poll puts BC United in any type of position where they could promise an end to the carbon tax or a dramatic change and still pick up support from the electorate?
This one, I think, is a bigger philosophical issue for the BC United. Of course, it was the BC Liberals that introduced the carbon tax to begin with. And so what it would mean is that the BC United would have to say it's not working anymore from something that they were very proud of at the time, and it gained worldwide recognition. But for the economy right now, for the world that we're in right now, it's not working anymore. So it needs some updating and some changes. That'll be the big question for the leader and his caucus. Are they willing to go back on an issue that they were so proud of years ago?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we'll wait and see what Kevin Falcon has to say about that. Thank you to the panel for being here this week. Make sure you subscribe to the audio podcast for extras this week, including spooky October discussion of what political leaders and parties might be fearing as we head into the Halloween season. Make sure you subscribe also on YouTube and on CHEK Plus. Thank you so much for watching. We will be back next week with all the latest here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.